When my daughter burst out laughing at my suitcase in the middle of Atlanta International Airport, I felt every pair of eyes around us turn in my direction. "Mom, please tell me you're not bringing that," Claire said, pointing at the old brown suitcase beside my feet. "It looks like something from a yard sale." A few people nearby chuckled. My daughter didn't lower her voice. "You're flying with us in business class, not a bus to Florida." I didn't argue. I just held the handle of that worn suitcase and watched my daughter shake her head in embarrassment. Because the truth was, the most important thing in that airport wasn't in Claire's designer luggage. It was inside my cheap suitcase. And she had no idea. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. If you've ever been embarrassed by someone you love or watched money change the way people treat their own family, you might understand this story more than you expect. So before we go on, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy emotional family stories like this. And I'm curious, where are you watching from today and what time is it there right now? Leave a comment and let me know. Sometimes the stories that hurt the most are the ones that connect us the most. Now let me tell you how that suitcase and my daughter's laughter changed everything. My name is Ann Carter, and when that moment happened at the airport, I was 67 years old. For most of my life, I had never owned anything expensive enough to make someone laugh at it. The suitcase Claire was mocking had been with me for nearly 20 years. It wasn't pretty. The brown fabric had faded to a dull, uneven color, and one of the wheels squeaked if you pulled it too fast. The handle had a strip of black tape around it where the rubber had cracked years ago. But it worked, and in my life, that had always been enough. I had spent 34 years working as a library supervisor in Savannah, Georgia. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was honest work, quiet work, the kind of job where people came in stressed and left a little calmer. Books have a way of doing that. My husband, Robert Carter, used to tease me that I loved the smell of old paper more than most people loved perfume, and maybe he was right. Robert had been a high school history teacher for most of his life. Between the two of us, we never made much money, but we made enough to build a steady life. A small house near the edge of Savannah, a vegetable garden in the backyard, and one daughter, Claire. When Claire was born, Robert cried harder than I did. I remember lying in the hospital bed while he stood by the window holding her, whispering promises that she would have every opportunity we never had. And he meant it. When Claire was 12, Robert started tutoring after school to earn extra money. I took on weekend shifts organizing archives at the public records office. We told ourselves it was temporary just until we saved enough for Claire's college fund. Temporary turned into almost 15 years. Claire was bright, smarter than both of us, if I'm honest. She had a way of walking into a room like she already knew she belonged there. Even as a teenager, she carried herself differently from other kids in our neighborhood. Confident, ambitious, hungry for something bigger. At first, Robert and I were proud of that hunger. We thought it meant she would build a life we never could. And in many ways, she did. Claire was accepted into a good university in North Carolina, a business school we could barely pronounce the name of when the acceptance letter arrived. I still remember how Robert framed that letter and hung it above his desk. We paid for as much of her tuition as we could. Scholarships covered part of it. Student loans covered the rest, but every semester there were still bills, housing, books, travel. Robert sold his old pickup truck the year Claire started her junior year. He told her it was because he wanted a more fuel-efficient car, but I knew the truth. The truck had paid for her final semester. Claire graduated with honors. The day she walked across that stage in her cap and gown, Robert squeezed my hand so tightly my fingers went numb. "We did it," he whispered. We really believed that. After college, Claire moved to Charlotte. She started working at a small real estate firm that specialized in high-end properties, luxury homes, private communities, places where the houses had gates and the kitchens were bigger than our entire living room. At first, she called us every week, then every couple of weeks, then once a month. Robert and I told ourselves that was normal. Young people build busy lives. They meet new friends. They work long hours. But over time, something else began to change. The way Claire spoke about things, the way she talked about people. I remember the first time she visited home after starting her job. She stood in our kitchen looking around like she was seeing it for the first time. "Mom," she said gently, "Have you ever thought about remodeling this place?" I laughed. "Honey, this house is older than you are." I know, she replied, opening the refrigerator and studying the contents like she was evaluating a property listing. But buyers today care about modern upgrades. Buyers. That was the first time I realized Claire had started seeing the world through a completely different lens. Everything had value. Everything could be upgraded. Everything could be improved. Except apparently the people who came from where she started. Over the years, the comments became more frequent. Little things. The curtains in our living room were outdated. My car looked tired. Robert's old sweaters made him look retired. None of it sounded cruel on the surface. Claire always said these things with a smile like she was offering helpful advice. But the tone behind the words slowly changed. There was a kind of embarrassment hiding underneath. Robert noticed it too, though he rarely said anything about it. He would just pat Claire on the shoulder and say something like, "Well, kiddo, old things still work just fine." Claire would laugh politely, but the warmth in her eyes wasn't the same anymore. A few years after she moved to Charlotte, Claire married Ryan Whitmore. Ryan worked in property investment. He was charming, polished, and always perfectly dressed, the kind of man who shook your hand with confidence and looked you directly in the eye. Robert liked him at first. Ryan talked about business opportunities, development projects, and market trends in a way that made it sound like he understood the future. But sometimes I caught small moments that made me uneasy. Ryan asking questions about our house. Ryan casually wondering how long Robert had owned the land. Ryan mentioning how much property values in Savannah had increased. At the time, I brushed it off. People in real estate talk about property the way fishermen talk about rivers. It's just part of the language. Still, something in Robert had quietly shifted. About 6 months before he passed away, he started organizing our financial papers. Old bank statements, investment folders, property records. One evening, I walked into the dining room and found him surrounded by stacks of documents. "You planning to open your own accounting firm?" I joked. He smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just making sure everything's in order," he said. Robert had always been careful, but this felt different. He began locking certain documents in a small safe in our bedroom closet. When I asked him about it, he told me not to worry. "It's just preparation," he said softly. "For what?" I asked. He paused. "For the future." At the time, I thought he meant illness, age, the normal things people prepare for after retirement. I didn't realize he might have been preparing for something else entirely. Robert passed away less than a year later. A quiet heart attack on a rainy Thursday morning. Claire came to the funeral dressed in a black coat that probably cost more than Robert's entire wardrobe. She cried, of course. She hugged me and told everyone how much her father had meant to her. But even during those difficult days, Ryan asked a question that stuck in my mind. "Anne," he said gently after the service, "have you thought about doing some estate planning? Just to keep things simple in the future?" And at the time, I assumed he was being helpful. I didn't realize that conversation was the beginning of something much bigger. And now, standing in the middle of Atlanta International Airport, years later, watching my daughter laugh at my suitcase, I suddenly understood something Robert had been trying to warn me about. Because inside that old suitcase wasn't just a few clothes for a weekend trip. It was every document Robert had carefully prepared before he died. Every record, every secret, and every piece of proof that my daughter and her husband had been asking the wrong questions for a very long time. The night before our flight to California, my house in Savannah felt quieter than usual. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that I had grown used to since Robert passed away. This was the uneasy kind, the sort that sits in the corners of a room and makes every sound feel louder than it should. The ticking clock in the hallway, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the wind brushing against the kitchen window. I had spent most of that evening pretending to pack normally. A few clothes, a sweater, my medication, the small toiletries bag I had been using for years. But the real packing didn't begin until almost midnight. That was when I walked into my bedroom, closed the door, and opened the closet where Robert had installed the safe. It was a simple metal box hidden behind a stack of old winter coats. Nothing fancy. Robert always believed that the best hiding places were the ones that looked ordinary. For a moment, my hand rested on the safe door. I could almost hear his voice. "And don't rush decisions when your heart is emotional." Robert used to say that whenever something important was happening. Slow down, look carefully, think twice. I took a deep breath and opened the safe. Inside were several folders Robert had arranged neatly before he died. Each one was labeled in his careful handwriting: property, investments, insurance, and one folder simply marked, "For Anne." I had opened it once before, just once. That was the night I read his letter. Even thinking about it now made my chest tighten. I took the folder out and placed it gently on the bed. For a long moment, I just sat there staring at it. Grief has a strange way of changing over time. In the first year after Robert died, the pain had been loud and overwhelming. Everything reminded me of him, his chair, his coffee mug, the way he used to whistle in the mornings. But over the years, the grief had softened into something quieter, a presence, a memory that lived beside me instead of crushing me. Yet that folder still had the power to bring everything rushing back. I opened it carefully. The letter was still inside. Robert's handwriting filled the page in neat, steady lines. The ink had faded slightly, but every word was still perfectly clear. I didn't read the entire letter again that night. I already knew what it said. Instead, I read only the part that had kept me awake for so many nights after his death. Anne, if you're reading this, it means I was right to trust your judgment. I hope I was wrong about what I suspect. I hope Claire never gives you a reason to doubt her heart. But if she does, you must protect yourself. Not because money matters more than family, but because the wrong kind of love can destroy both. I closed my eyes. Robert had always believed in people. Even when he worried, he still hoped for the best. But during his final months, he had started noticing things I had overlooked. Questions Claire asked, comments Ryan made, the way conversations sometimes drifted toward property values and financial decisions. At the time, Robert never accused anyone directly. That wasn't his nature. Instead, he quietly prepared. Inside the safe were documents I had barely understood when he first explained them. Legal structures, trust accounts, investment records, and something else, a small black notebook. I reached for it now. Robert had always written things down: lesson plans, grocery lists, ideas for his history classes. But this notebook was different. This one contained numbers, dates, transactions, page after page of careful notes. At first glance, it looked like a simple financial ledger. But when I started reading it months earlier, I realized what Robert had been doing. He had been tracking money, not just our money, Claire's requests, small loans we had given her over the years, payments we had made quietly when she said she needed help. I had forgotten about many of them. Robert hadn't. Every entry had a date, a note, a reason. Claire emergency apartment deposit, Claire business licensing fee, Claire temporary support during market slowdown. Individually, none of those amounts had seemed alarming. Parents help their children. That's what we do. But seeing them all together on those pages had changed something. The total number at the bottom of the final page had stunned me, not because of the amount, but because of something Robert had written underneath it. One simple sentence: Anne may not remember these things. I want her to know the truth. I closed the notebook slowly. That truth had taken months to settle inside my mind. Claire had never technically stolen anything from us. She had always framed her requests carefully: a temporary loan, a short-term emergency, just until the next deal closed. And Robert had always said yes. But looking at those pages, I realized something else. Claire had never once paid any of it back, not a dollar. At the time, I told myself that didn't matter. Parents don't keep score with their children. But Robert had. Not out of anger, out of caution. I placed the notebook beside the folder and opened the next document: the property records. Our house in Savannah had been in Robert's family for generations. His grandfather had purchased the land long before the city expanded in that direction. Back then, it had been considered the outskirts. Now it sat less than 15 minutes from the historic district. Over the past decade, developers had slowly begun buying land nearby: hotels, luxury apartments, boutique shopping areas. Property values had been rising steadily. Claire knew that. Ryan definitely knew that. I carefully slid the property documents into the suitcase lying open on the bed. Next came the investment records Robert had built quietly over 30 years. Small contributions, slow growth, nothing flashy, but the numbers had multiplied more than I ever expected. Finally, I reached for the small velvet box Robert had left beside the folder. Inside was a ring, not a wedding ring, something older. Robert had once told me it belonged to his grandmother. It wasn't particularly large, but the diamond caught the light in a way that made it feel important. He had never explained why he kept it locked away, but the box also contained something else. A tiny silver key, attached to a tag with Robert's handwriting. Safe deposit. I added the box to the suitcase. One by one, the items filled the empty space inside. The notebook, the property documents, the investment records, the velvet box, and finally the letter. When I zipped the suitcase closed, the sound felt louder than it should have in the quiet room. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it. From the outside, it looked like nothing special. A tired old suitcase that had traveled through too many airports. But inside it now were decades of history. Secrets Robert had quietly prepared, and answers to questions my daughter didn't even know she had asked. The next morning, I would take that suitcase to the airport. I didn't know exactly what was waiting for me in Napa Valley. I didn't know what Claire and Ryan were planning, but one thing had become very clear. Whatever they thought they were about to gain from this trip, they had no idea what I was bringing with me. The line at the airline check-in counter stretched halfway across the terminal. Atlanta's airport always felt like a city of its own, people rushing past with coffee cups, rolling suitcases, clattering across the tile floor. Loudspeaker announcements echoing overhead every few minutes. Claire stood a few feet ahead of me, scrolling through her phone with the kind of impatient energy that always made it clear she believed her time was more valuable than everyone else's. Ryan stood beside her, tall and relaxed, one hand resting casually on the sleek silver suitcase that matched Claire's. Their luggage looked like something out of a luxury travel advertisement. Mine looked like it had survived a yard sale and 3 decades of family vacations. Claire glanced back at it again and sighed. "Mom, I still don't understand why you didn't let me order you a new suitcase," she said. "I told you I could have had one delivered overnight." "It works," I replied quietly. She made a small sound of frustration. "That's not the point." Ryan chuckled softly. "Claire just likes everything to look coordinated," he said. I nodded politely, though I wasn't entirely sure what that meant. The line moved forward a few steps. A young airline employee waved us toward the counter. "Next, please." Claire immediately stepped ahead, flashing the confident smile I had seen her use 1,000 times when she wanted to impress someone. "Hi," she said, brightly, sliding her passport across the counter. "We're checking in for the Napa Valley flight." The employee typed something into the computer. 3 passengers traveling together. "Yes," Claire replied, gesturing vaguely toward me without turning around. "My husband and my mother." The young woman behind the counter looked up and smiled warmly. "Welcome, Miss Carter." It took Claire a second to realize the employee was speaking to me. The smile on her face flickered slightly. "Yes," Claire said quickly. "My mom doesn't travel much, so we're helping her through everything." I hadn't even opened my mouth. The airline employee glanced at my suitcase as I placed it gently on the scale. "Is this your checked bag, ma'am?" "Yes." She printed the tag and attached it carefully. Claire leaned slightly toward the counter. "Actually," she said with a small laugh, "is there any chance that could go in cargo a little farther away from the premium luggage?" The employee looked confused. "I'm sorry." Claire smiled as if she were making a harmless joke. "It's just older than the rest of our bags." I felt a strange heat rise in my chest. Not anger exactly. Something more tired than that. The employee didn't laugh. Instead, she looked at Claire for a moment, then turned back to me. "Well, she said kindly bags that have traveled a long time usually have the best stories." I smiled at her. "That one definitely does." Claire rolled her eyes. Ryan shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Within a few minutes, our boarding passes were printed. "Gate B27, the employee said. Boarding starts in 45 minutes. Claire grabbed the passes quickly. "Great, thank you." We stepped away from the counter and into the flow of passengers moving towards security. Claire handed Ryan his boarding pass, then gave mine to me without looking up from her phone. "You'll want to stay close," she said. "Security here gets chaotic." "I've flown before," I said gently. I know she replied quickly, "just not recently." Ryan cleared his throat. "We've got plenty of time," he said. "Maybe we grab coffee after security." Claire nodded absently. "Sure." We joined the line for the security checkpoint. For a few minutes, none of us spoke. People moved slowly forward, removing shoes, placing laptops in plastic bins, adjusting belts and jackets. I noticed Claire watching the people around us carefully, not in a curious way, in a calculating way. Her eyes moved from one traveler to another, quietly evaluating clothes bags' posture. She had developed a habit of reading people the way real estate agents read houses, assessing, ranking, judging. Ryan leaned closer to her. "Did Mark text you?" he asked quietly. Claire shook her head. "Not yet. He said he'd be at the vineyard by noon." Claire nodded. "I know." Their voices were low, but I could still hear them. Then Claire lowered her voice even further. "Just remember," she murmured, "we shouldn't rush things." Ryan nodded slowly. "I know." "Mom gets emotional when people talk about Dad," Claire continued. "If the conversation happens naturally, she'll be more likely to sign." The words landed softly but heavily. "Sign." I stared straight ahead, pretending I hadn't heard anything. Ryan glanced briefly in my direction. "Maybe we should wait until after dinner," he whispered. Claire shook her head. "No, earlier is better." The security line moved forward again. Neither of them noticed my hand tightening slightly around the handle of my suitcase. "Sign what?" The question repeated in my mind, but deep down, I already suspected the answer. When it was finally our turn at the scanner, I placed my shoes, purse, and small carry-on items into the plastic bin. The suitcase had already been checked earlier, which meant it was now somewhere behind the airport walls, moving through conveyor belts and sorting machines. Claire passed through the metal detector first. Ryan followed. When it was my turn, the officer waved me through without a second glance. On the other side, I slowly put my shoes back on, while Claire and Ryan waited near the exit. Claire looked impatient again. "Mom, you okay?" she asked. "Yes, you're moving a little slow." "I'm fine." She sighed. "All right." We stepped back into the busy concourse. The terminal buzzed with activity. Restaurants, travelers rushing between gates, screens flashing departure times. Ryan gestured toward a small cafe nearby. "Coffee." Claire nodded. "That works." We found a table near the window overlooking the runway. Claire ordered an iced latte. Ryan ordered black coffee. I asked for tea. For a while, the conversation stayed light. Claire talked about the vineyard where we would be staying in Napa Valley. Apparently, it belonged to one of Ryan's business partners. "Amazing place," she said. "Private guest houses, beautiful views, top-tier wine." Ryan nodded. "And some interesting investment opportunities." Claire smiled. "Exactly." Then she glanced at me. "Mom, you brought the documents I asked about, right?" My fingers tightened slightly around the warm cup of tea. "What documents?" "The house paperwork," she said casually. "And the financial stuff Dad used to manage." "Oh," I replied calmly. "Yes." Claire smiled with visible relief. "Perfect." Ryan leaned back in his chair. "That'll make everything much easier." I looked out the window toward the runway. Planes were lifting into the sky one after another, each one carrying hundreds of people toward destinations they believed they understood. Claire stirred her drink thoughtfully. "Once we get everything organized," she said, "you won't have to worry about managing any of it anymore." I turned back toward her slowly. "What do you mean?" She smiled again. "That's what the paperwork is for." Ryan nodded beside her. "Just a few signatures, Anne," he said smoothly. "Nothing complicated." For a moment, I said nothing. Then I picked up my tea and took a quiet sip. Inside my mind, Robert's voice returned again. "Slow down. Look carefully. Think twice." Claire leaned forward slightly. "You did bring the documents, though, right?" I met her eyes. "Yes," I said calmly. "They're with me." Neither of them realized how true that answer really was, and neither of them had the slightest idea what those documents actually said. Our boarding group was called about 20 minutes later. Claire stood up immediately, smoothing the front of her designer jacket as if the act of boarding an airplane were some kind of public performance. Ryan followed her with the same calm confidence he seemed to carry everywhere. I walked behind them, moving a little slower than the younger passengers around me. Not because I couldn't keep up, because I was thinking. Robert had always told me that when people rush you, it's usually because they don't want you to think too carefully. And Claire had been rushing all morning. We stepped onto the jet bridge and into the plane. The flight attendant greeted us warmly and directed us toward the business class cabin. Claire had insisted we fly there. though she framed it as a gesture of kindness. "You shouldn't be squeezed into economy at your age, Mom," she had said when she booked the tickets. At the time, I believed she was trying to be thoughtful. Now I suspected the real reason was simpler. Important conversations happen more easily when people are comfortable. The business class seats were large and soft, with wide armrests and small reading lamps built into the panels. Claire took the seat by the window. Ryan sat beside her, and I settled into the seat across the aisle. Claire buckled her seatbelt and immediately opened her phone again. Ryan glanced toward me. "You doing okay, Anne?" he asked politely. "Yes," I said. "Good." The engines outside began to hum as passengers finished boarding. For a moment, none of us spoke. I watched the flight attendants move through the aisle, helping people store bags and explaining safety instructions. Claire leaned slightly toward Ryan and lowered her voice. "You think Mom suspects anything?" she whispered. Ryan shrugged. "Doubt it. She didn't ask questions when I mentioned the paperwork. She probably trusts you." Claire smiled faintly. "Well, she should." I kept my eyes on the safety card in my lap. Trust. That word had meant something very different when Claire was younger. When she was 8 years old, she used to run into our house after school and tell us everything about her day, who she sat with at lunch, what she learned in math class, which teacher she liked the most. Back then, trust had meant something simple. You tell the truth because you love someone. You believe someone because you know their heart. But somewhere along the way, Claire had learned another version of trust, the kind people use when they expect something in return. The plane began to move slowly away from the gate. The flight attendant gave the safety demonstration, and a few minutes later, the engines roared louder as we rolled toward the runway. Claire looked out the window. "I love this part," she said quietly. "What part?" Ryan asked. "The moment right before takeoff, when everything feels like it's about to start." I wondered if she realized how true that statement actually was. The plane lifted into the air smoothly. Savannah was already far behind us, but the weight of the past seemed to travel easily. Once the seatbelt sign turned off, a flight attendant came by offering drinks. Ryan ordered a bourbon. Claire asked for sparkling wine. I requested water. Claire glanced at me with mild surprise. "No wine?" she asked. "I'm fine with water." She shrugged and turned back toward Ryan. For the next hour, the conversation stayed light. Claire talked about the vineyard where we would be staying. Apparently, it belonged to a man named Mark Halpern, one of Ryan's investment partners. According to Claire, Mark owned several luxury properties across California and was looking for new opportunities on the East Coast. "He's brilliant with land development," Ryan explained. Claire nodded enthusiastically, "especially with historic properties." That sentence hung in the air for a moment. Ryan noticed it too. He cleared his throat lightly. "Of course, that's just general business talk," he added. Claire waved her hand casually. "Yes, but Mom's house in Savannah is in such a great location now." I looked at her calmly. "Is it?" "Of course it is," Claire said quickly. "The entire area is growing." Ryan leaned forward slightly. "You ever had the property professionally evaluated?" he asked. "No." Claire looked surprised. Really, Robert had once told me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a conversation is simply answer honestly and wait. People often reveal more than they intend when silence follows. Claire glanced at Ryan again. "That's something we could easily take care of," she said. Ryan nodded. "There are firms that specialize in historical properties like yours." Claire took a sip of her wine. "And once we have all the paperwork organized, managing things will be so much easier." There it was again. Paperwork. Managing things. The words sounded harmless, but they were appearing too frequently to be accidental. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "What paperwork?" I asked. Claire smiled like a patient teacher explaining something simple. "Oh, just standard estate planning stuff." Ryan nodded in agreement. "Things like power of attorney, financial oversight, long-term management, especially since you're living alone now," Claire added. The sentence was gentle, but the meaning behind it felt sharp. Living alone. I wondered if she realized how many nights I had sat quietly in the same living room where she used to play with toy horses on the carpet. How many mornings I still poured 2 cups of coffee before remembering there was no one left to drink the second one. Living alone wasn't the frightening thing she imagined. Losing trust was. Ryan leaned forward slightly. The truth is, Anne, he said carefully, assets can become complicated as people get older. Claire nodded sympathetically. And we just want to help. Help! That word sounded so generous. But Robert's notebook had shown me what help sometimes looked like. Loans that were never repaid, requests that never stopped, questions that always circled back to money. The flight attendant returned with a tray of small snacks. Claire picked up a piece of chocolate and smiled again. Anyway, she said lightly, we'll talk about all that later. Ryan raised his glass slightly. To Napa Valley. Claire clinked her glass against his. To a productive weekend. I watched them both for a moment, then I reached for my water and took a slow sip. Productive. That was an interesting choice of words for a family trip. Outside the window, clouds stretched across the sky like soft white fields. The plane cruised quietly above them, carrying us toward California. Claire leaned back in her seat, looking satisfied. Ryan opened his laptop and began typing something quickly. Neither of them noticed me watching. Neither of them realized that the documents they were hoping to control had already been carefully reviewed, prepared, protected, and tucked safely inside the old suitcase they had laughed at in the airport. Robert had spent his entire life teaching history. One thing he always believed was that people who ignored the past were often surprised when it caught up with them. As the plane continued west toward Napa Valley, I had the strange feeling that my daughter and her husband were about to learn exactly what he meant. By the time we landed in California, the sky had turned a soft golden color. Sunlight stretched across the hills like a painting, warm, quiet, almost peaceful. It was the kind of place people came to forget stress, to drink expensive wine, and to pretend life was simpler than it really was. Claire stepped off the plane first, already back in her confident rhythm. "Welcome to Napa," she said over her shoulder, as if she personally owned the entire valley. Ryan smiled. "Feels like business already." I followed behind them, taking in the unfamiliar air. Savannah had always smelled like humidity and history oak trees, river breeze, old brick. Napa smelled different, cleaner, lighter, like something new was always about to begin, or something old was about to end. We collected our luggage in silence. When my suitcase finally appeared on the carousel, I stepped forward and lifted it carefully. The wheel gave its usual small squeak when it touched the ground. Claire noticed immediately. She sighed. "Mom, that sound, it still rolls," I replied calmly. Ryan gave a polite half smile. "At least it's easy to recognize." Claire shook her head. "I swear people probably think we picked that up by accident." I didn't respond. Instead, I tightened my grip on the handle, because unlike them, I knew exactly how carefully that suitcase had been packed. Outside the airport, a black SUV was waiting. The driver stepped out and greeted Ryan by name. "Mr. Whitmore, welcome back." Claire smiled, clearly pleased. "Mark really does everything right," she said as we climbed into the vehicle. The drive to the vineyard took nearly an hour. Rolling hills stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, covered in rows of grapevines that looked perfectly aligned, almost unreal in their precision. Claire talked most of the way. She described the vineyard, the guest house, the people we would meet, the dinner planned for the following night. "Mark's hosting a private gathering," she said. "Investors, developers, people you'd never meet anywhere else." Ryan nodded. "Good connections." Claire turned slightly toward me. "It'll be good for you too, Mom. A change of environment." I looked out the window. I'm sure it will. But something in her tone didn't feel like she was talking about relaxation. It felt like preparation. When we finally arrived, the property was even more impressive than Claire had described. The main house sat on top of a gentle hill surrounded by perfectly trimmed gardens and rows of vines stretching into the distance. Large windows reflected the evening light, and a long stone driveway curved toward the entrance. It looked like the kind of place that belonged in magazines. Claire stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply. "See," she said, smiling, "worth the trip already." Ryan stretched his arms slightly. "Not bad." A man in his 50s stepped out of the house to greet us. Tall, confident, wearing a tailored shirt that probably cost more than anything I had packed. "Claire," he said, warmly, opening his arms. "Mark," Claire replied, hugging him lightly. "Ryan, good to see you again," Ryan said. Then Mark turned to me. "And you must be Anne." His smile was polite but measured. "Welcome." "Thank you," I said. His handshake was firm, professional, the kind of handshake that evaluated as much as it greeted. "Let me show you to the guest house," Mark said. We followed him along a stone path that led to a smaller building just behind the main house. It was beautiful in a quiet, understated way. White walls, large windows, soft lighting. Inside, everything was perfectly arranged. Claire looked around approvingly. "This is perfect," Mark smiled. "Dinner will be served in the main house in about an hour," Claire nodded. "We'll be there." After he left, Claire turned immediately to me. "Mom, take the bedroom on the left," she said. "It's smaller, but it should be fine." I nodded. "That's fine." Ryan carried in the luggage. He placed their sleek suitcases near the larger bedroom and set mine gently near the door. For a moment, all three of us stood in silence. Then Claire clapped her hands softly. "Okay, quick refresh, then dinner." She disappeared into her room. Ryan followed shortly after. I was left alone in the quiet living space. The silence felt different from the silence in my home, less familiar, more watchful. I picked up my suitcase and carried it into the smaller bedroom. The room was simple but elegant. A neatly made bed, a small desk, a window overlooking the vineyard. I placed the suitcase on the bed and stood there for a moment looking at it. Then I slowly opened it. Everything was still exactly where I had placed it. The folder, the notebook, the velvet box, the letter. I let out a quiet breath. No one had gotten into it, at least not yet. I closed the suitcase again and locked it carefully. As I turned the key, a thought crossed my mind. If Claire had tried to open it at the hotel, it meant one thing. She wasn't just curious. She was searching. A soft knock came from the door. Mom Claire's voice. "Yes." She stepped inside without waiting. "Hey," she said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Just checking in. I'm fine." She looked at the suitcase briefly, then back at me. "You brought everything, right?" she asked. There it was again. "Not did you pack what you need, not are you comfortable." "Everything, yes," I said. Claire smiled. "Good." She hesitated for a moment, then stepped a little closer. "You know, Mom, this trip is important." "In what way?" She tilted her head slightly. "It's just a chance to get things organized." Organized. Another word that sounded harmless, but carried too much weight. "I've managed just fine so far," I said. "I know," Claire replied quickly. "But it doesn't have to be complicated anymore." Her tone softened. Almost convincing, almost kind. If something ever happened, she continued, it would be really difficult for us to step in without the proper documents. Us step in. Without asking. Without permission. I held her gaze. "I'm not planning on anything happening." Claire gave a small laugh. "No one ever is." She reached out and touched my arm lightly. "I just want to make sure everything's taken care of." For a brief moment, I saw something in her eyes. Not warmth, not quite. Something closer to urgency. Then it disappeared. "Anyway," she said, stepping back, "we should get ready for dinner." She left the room before I could respond. The door closed softly behind her. I stood there for a long moment. Then I turned back toward the suitcase. Robert's voice echoed again in my memory. "If she tries to control it, protect yourself." I walked over to the bed and rested my hand on the worn fabric. From the outside, it still looked like nothing. Old, cheap, embarrassing, but inside it was the truth Claire and Ryan were trying so hard to reach. And for the first time since this trip began, I was certain of something. They weren't going to stop, not until they got what they wanted, or until they realized they never would. Dinner that evening was everything Claire had promised. Soft lighting, long wooden tables, crystal glasses that caught the glow of the chandeliers above. The main house felt less like a home and more like a carefully curated experience, every detail designed to impress without seeming like it was trying too hard. Mark greeted us again at the entrance this time, with a glass of wine already in hand. "Glad you could join us," he said. Claire stepped forward easily, slipping into conversation as if she had always belonged in rooms like this. Ryan followed, already discussing market trends with another man near the bar. I stayed a step behind, observing. That had always been my strength. In the library, you learn to notice things most people overlook. The way someone's tone changes when they speak to different people. The subtle shift in posture when someone feels uncomfortable. the quiet signals that reveal more than words ever do. Tonight, those small details were everywhere. Claire's smile, bright, practiced, but slightly tighter when she glanced in my direction. Ryan's laughter, smooth, controlled, but distracted. Mark's eyes always moving, always measuring. We took our seats at the table. Claire sat beside Mark, Ryan across from them. I was placed slightly to the side between two guests I had never met. Anne Wright. The woman next to me said kindly, "I'm Rebecca. Nice to meet you. Claire speaks very highly of you," she added. I smiled politely. "That's nice to hear." Rebecca leaned in slightly. "She's impressive," she said, "very driven." "Yes," I replied softly. "She always has been." Across the table, Claire was already in the middle of a story. "And Charlotte's market is still expanding," she was saying, "especially for historic properties." Mark nodded. "That's where the real value is," Ryan joined in, "if you know how to position them correctly." Claire laughed lightly. "Exactly." Then, almost casually, she added, "My mom actually owns a property in Savannah. Been in the family for generations." The conversation paused just enough for everyone to register the information. Mark turned his attention toward me. "Savannah," he said. "That's a very interesting market right now." I met his gaze calmly. "So I've heard." Claire smiled, pleased with the direction things were going. "It's in a really great location, too," she continued. "Close to the historic district." Ryan nodded. "Untouched for years." The word untouched lingered, as if the house were not a home, but an opportunity waiting to be claimed. Mark leaned back slightly. "Have you ever considered developing it?" he asked. I took a slow sip of water before answering. "No." Claire let out a small laugh. "Mom's very traditional," she said. "She doesn't like change." I looked at her. "I like things that last." There was a subtle shift in the air. Mark smiled politely. "Of course. But sometimes development preserves value, or replaces it," I replied gently. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ryan jumped in smoothly. "It's all about balance," he said, "respecting history while maximizing potential." Claire nodded. "That's what we've been talking about, actually helping Mom manage things more efficiently." Manage. There it was again. Rebecca glanced between us, sensing something but not quite understanding it. "That sounds helpful," she said carefully. Claire smiled. "It is." Dinner continued, but the conversation kept circling back to the same themes. Property, value, management, control. Every word sounded reasonable on its own, but together they painted a picture that was becoming clearer with every passing minute. At one point, Mark leaned toward Ryan and spoke quietly, though not quietly enough. "You think she'll go for it?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. "Claire's working on it," he said finally. "Working on it." I kept my expression neutral, but inside something settled into place. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a plan. And I was the last piece of it. As dessert was served, Claire reached for her wine glass and turned toward me with a softer expression. "Mom," she said, her voice almost gentle, "are you enjoying yourself?" "Yes, I'm glad you came." I studied her face. For a moment I searched for the little girl she used to be. The one who used to hold my hand crossing the street, the one who used to fall asleep on the couch with a book in her lap. But the woman sitting across from me now felt like someone else entirely. "I am too," I said. Claire smiled. "Good." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "We'll go over everything tomorrow morning." I tilted my head slightly. "Everything?" "The paperwork," she said lightly, "just to get it out of the way." Ryan nodded in agreement. "Won't take long." I folded my hands in my lap. "I see." Claire leaned closer. "It'll make things easier for everyone," she said quietly. "Everyone." I wondered if she truly believed that, or if she had simply repeated it enough times that it sounded true. After dinner, guests began to drift into smaller groups. Some moved toward the patio. Others gathered near the fireplace. Claire was pulled into another conversation with Mark. Ryan followed shortly after. I stepped outside onto the patio alone. The night air was cool and still. Rows of grapevines stretched out into the darkness, illuminated faintly by soft lights along the pathways. For a moment I allowed myself to breathe, really breathe, because everything that had been building since the airport was now undeniable. This trip wasn't about spending time together. It wasn't about helping me. It wasn't even about family. It was about control. Footsteps approached behind me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said. I turned. Linda Morales stood there. For a second, I didn't react. Then I felt something inside me steady. "Linda," I said quietly. She smiled. "Anne?" Claire's voice echoed faintly from inside the house, laughing at something someone had said. Linda stepped beside me, looking out over the vineyard. "I got your message," she said softly. "I'm glad you came. I had a feeling this wasn't just a vacation." I let out a small breath. "It isn't." Linda glanced back toward the house. "They're pushing you, yes. How hard? Hard enough." She nodded slowly. "I reviewed the documents you sent, and they're not harmless," she said. "Not even close." I felt my grip tighten slightly. "I thought so." Linda turned toward me. "They're trying to gain control, Anne, financially and possibly legally." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Hearing it said out loud made it real in a way nothing else had. "They think I don't understand," I said quietly. Linda's expression softened. "That's their mistake." We stood in silence for a moment. Then she asked, "What do you want to do?" I looked back toward the house. Through the glass doors, I could see Claire laughing, her hand resting lightly on Ryan's arm. She looked confident, certain, untouchable. I turned back to Linda. "I don't want to fight them in private," I said. Linda raised an eyebrow. No. I shook my head slowly. "If I do that, they'll twist it. They'll make it sound like I'm confused or emotional." Linda nodded. "They will." I met her eyes. "I want them to show who they really are." A small smile appeared on Linda's face. "Then we'll give them the opportunity." I took a deep breath. "Tomorrow morning." That's what Claire had said. "We'll go over everything." I looked down at my hands, then back at the house. "They think they're leading this," I said softly. Linda followed my gaze. "For now." I nodded. But not for much longer. The next morning arrived too quickly. Sunlight poured through the thin curtains of the guest house, soft and golden, the kind of light people paid good money to wake up to. For a moment lying there in the unfamiliar bed, I almost forgot where I was. Almost. Then I remembered the dinner, the conversations, the way Claire's voice kept circling back to the same word: paperwork. I sat up slowly, letting the quiet settle around me. The house was still. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint sound of wind brushing across the vineyard outside. For a brief moment, I considered what it would feel like to leave, to pack up quietly, call a car, and go back to Savannah before any of this unfolded. But Robert's voice returned again, steady and certain. "If she tries to control it, protect yourself." Leaving wouldn't protect anything. It would only delay what was already happening. I got out of bed and walked to the small table where I had placed my suitcase the night before. It looked exactly the same as always. Old, worn, unremarkable. I rested my hand on the handle. Inside, everything was still in place. Everything they wanted. Everything they didn't understand. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Mom Claire's voice. I closed my eyes briefly, then answered. Yes. She opened the door without waiting. Already dressed, already composed, already in control. "Morning," she said, smiling. "Hope you slept well." "I did. Good." She stepped into the room, her eyes flicking briefly to the suitcase before returning to my face. "We're having breakfast in the main house," she said, "and then we can go over everything." There it was again. Everything. I nodded. "I'll be there in a minute." Claire hesitated, then stepped a little closer. "You brought the documents with you, right?" she asked casually. "Yes." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Perfect," she smiled again. "We'll make this quick and easy, quick, easy." I wondered which part she believed. After she left, I took my time getting ready. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to. Robert had always said that rushing gives other people the advantage, and today I wasn't giving anyone anything. When I finally stepped outside, the morning air felt crisp and calm. The vineyard stretched endlessly under the sunlight, peaceful and quiet in a way that almost made everything else feel unreal. Almost. Inside the main house, breakfast had already been set. Fresh fruit, pastries, coffee, everything arranged perfectly. Claire sat at the table with Ryan, both of them already halfway through their meal. Mom Claire said brightly, "There you are." "Good morning," Ryan added. "Good morning." I took a seat across from them. For a few minutes, we ate in silence. Claire sipped her coffee. Ryan checked his phone. I watched them both carefully, waiting. Then Claire set her cup down. So she said, her tone shifting slightly, "Should we take a look at those documents?" There it was. Direct now. No more pretending. I reached for my tea. "Which documents?" Claire gave a small laugh. "Mom!" Ryan leaned forward slightly. "The property paperwork," he said smoothly, "and the financial records your husband managed." I nodded slowly. "Yes." Claire smiled. "Great. If you have them with you, we can just go through everything together." I looked at her. "Here." "Why not?" she replied lightly. "We've got time before lunch." Ryan nodded. "It's better to handle things early." I let a few seconds pass. Then I said calmly, "I think we should wait." Claire blinked. "Wait, yes." "For what? For later," I said. Claire's expression tightened slightly. "Mom, there's really no reason to delay this." "I'm not delaying," I replied gently. "I'm choosing the right moment." Ryan exchanged a quick glance with Claire. A silent conversation passed between them. Then Claire forced a smile. "Okay," she said. "When would you prefer tonight?" Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Tonight, yes." Ryan leaned back in his chair. "That's fine," he said. "We can go over everything after dinner." Claire hesitated. I could see the calculation in her eyes, the adjustment, the shift in strategy. Then she nodded. "All right," she said, "tonight." She picked up her coffee again, but her movements were sharper now, less relaxed, less certain. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ryan broke the silence. "So he said casually, Mark's hosting another gathering tonight." Claire nodded quickly. "Yes, smaller group, more focused." Ryan looked at me. "Good opportunity to meet people." I met his gaze. "I'm sure it will be." Claire leaned forward slightly. "And after that, we can go over everything privately," she added. I smiled. "We'll see." That was all I said. But it was enough. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. Ryan's expression remained calm, but I noticed the way his eyes narrowed just a fraction. They didn't like uncertainty. They didn't like losing control. Good. Breakfast ended shortly after that. Claire stood first. "I need to make a few calls," she said. "Excuse me?" Ryan followed her. "Same here." I remained at the table, finishing my tea slowly. Across the room, I could hear their voices in the hallway. Low. Urgent. She's hesitating. "We need to keep this on track." "Tonight, then." I didn't try to listen too closely. I didn't need to. I already knew. When I finally stood up, the room felt different, like something invisible had shifted. The calm surface of the morning was still there, but underneath it, tension had begun to build. I stepped outside again, letting the sunlight wash over me. In the distance, rows of grapevines moved gently in the breeze. Everything looked peaceful, orderly, controlled. But I knew better now. Control is often just an illusion. And today that illusion was starting to crack. Tonight, Claire believed she would finally get what she wanted. The documents, the signatures, the control. She thought she was waiting for the right moment. What she didn't realize was that I was too. I spent the rest of the morning moving slowly on purpose. There's a kind of strength in slowness that people like Claire rarely understand. When you don't rush, you force everything around you to reveal itself more clearly. Claire and Ryan, on the other hand, were anything but slow. By the time I returned to the guest house, they had already disappeared into phone calls and emails, pacing between rooms, stepping outside, lowering their voices whenever they passed near me. I didn't ask what they were doing. I already knew. They were adjusting, recalculating, trying to steer the situation back into something they could control. Around midday, I walked out toward the vineyard paths alone. The rows of grapevines stretched endlessly, each line perfectly aligned, each plant carefully maintained. It looked effortless from a distance, but I knew better. Anything that looks that perfect is the result of constant control, constant trimming, constant shaping. Left alone, it would grow wild, unpredictable, free. I wondered, not for the first time, when Claire had decided she needed to control everything around her. Or maybe the better question was, when had she decided she needed to control me? And I turned. Linda Morales was walking toward me along the narrow gravel path. She wore a simple blouse and dark slacks. Nothing flashy, but there was a quiet authority in the way she carried herself. "Linda," she smiled as she approached. "You look like you're thinking." "I am." "Good," she said. "We'll need that tonight." We began walking slowly side by side, the gravel crunching softly under our feet. I watched breakfast from the patio, Linda said. You handled that well. I didn't do anything. You did exactly what you needed to, she replied. You didn't react. I nodded. They're pushing harder now. They will, Linda said, because they can feel the timeline slipping. I glanced at her. Timeline. They expected you to sign this morning, she explained. When that didn't happen, everything shifted. I considered that. Claire had seemed so certain, so prepared. Yes, I said quietly. I saw it in her face. Linda stopped walking and turned to me. And she said gently, I need to be very clear with you. I met her eyes. The documents they want you to sign aren't just about convenience, she continued. They give Ryan significant control over your financial assets. I know. Linda nodded. But there's more. Something in her tone changed. What? She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. These are copies of what you sent me, she said, and some additional notes I made. I took the folder slowly. Linda continued. There's a clause buried in the paperwork that allows them to petition for extended authority if they can demonstrate that you're unable to manage your own affairs. I felt a chill move through me. Unable, yes. How would they prove that Linda held my gaze? By creating a situation where you appear confused, overwhelmed, or dependent. The words settled heavily in the air between us. They're not just trying to help, I said quietly. No, Linda replied. They're preparing to take control. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The vineyard stretched out around us, calm and beautiful, completely untouched by the reality of what was unfolding. They think I'm weak, I said, finally. Linda gave a small, knowing smile. That's their biggest mistake. I looked down at the folder in my hands. They've been planning this for a while, haven't they? Yes, and they think tonight is the moment. Linda nodded. They'll try to get you to sign in a controlled environment, probably after dinner when emotions are high and defenses are low. I let out a slow breath. That won't happen. I know. We started walking again. What about the trust, I asked. Linda's expression softened slightly. It's secure, she said. Your husband did an excellent job. I felt something inside me ease just a little. They can't touch it without your explicit consent, she continued. And even then, there are safeguards. Good. Linda glanced at me. You're still planning to reveal everything tonight, yes. Publicly, yes. She studied me for a moment. That's going to be difficult. I know. They'll deny everything. I know. They'll try to make you look emotional. I met her eyes. I'm not afraid of that. Linda nodded slowly. All right. We walked in silence for a few minutes. Then she said, Do you have everything ready? I thought about the suitcase, the documents, the notebook, the letter. Yes. Good. Linda stopped again and turned to face me fully. Then tonight, you let them speak first, she said. Let them show everyone exactly who they are. And then you open the suitcase. The words landed with a quiet finality. For a moment, I imagined the scene, the room, the people. Claire standing there, confident, composed, and then everything changing. I tightened my grip slightly on the folder. She laughed at it, I said softly. Linda raised an eyebrow. The suitcase. I let out a small breath. She thought it was embarrassing. Linda's expression softened. People often underestimate what they don't understand. I nodded, yes. We turned back toward the house. From a distance, I could see Claire standing on the patio, her phone pressed to her ear, her posture tense. Ryan stood nearby, watching her carefully. Even from far away, I could feel the shift in their energy. Less confidence, more urgency. They were running out of time. As we approached, Claire ended her call and forced a smile. Mom, she said, there you are. Her eyes flicked briefly to Linda. Oh, hi, Linda replied calmly. Claire's smile tightened. I didn't realize you were coming. I was invited, Linda said. Claire glanced at Ryan. Another silent exchange. Then she turned back to me. Mom, we need to talk later, she said. I nodded. We will. Her expression sharpened slightly. Privately. I held her gaze. We'll see. Ryan stepped forward smoothly. Dinner's at 7, he said. Mark's expecting a smaller group tonight. Claire added quickly, it's important. I almost smiled. I'm sure it is. For a moment, none of us moved. Then Claire turned away, already reaching for her phone again. Ryan followed her. Linda stood beside me quietly. They're feeling it now, she said. Yes, good. I looked toward the guest house in the distance. Inside it, resting on the bed, was the suitcase Claire had laughed at. Old, worn, ordinary. But inside it was the truth they had spent so long trying to control. And tonight, they were finally going to see it. The hours leading up to dinner felt longer than the entire flight from Atlanta. Time has a strange way of stretching when you know something is coming, something unavoidable, something that will change everything once it happens. Claire and Ryan spent most of the afternoon moving in and out of conversations, their voices low, their expressions carefully controlled. Every now and then, Claire would glance in my direction as if trying to read something in my face, but I gave her nothing. No resistance. No agreement. Just calm. And that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle her. Around 5 o'clock, I returned to the guest house. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the vineyard. The air had cooled slightly, carrying a quiet stillness that felt almost like a pause before a storm. Inside, the room looked exactly as I had left it. The bed neatly made, the curtains half drawn, and the suitcase resting exactly where it had been. I walked toward it slowly. For a moment, I simply stood there looking at it. So much of my life, my marriage, my memories, my trust, had been reduced to what was inside that worn piece of luggage. I reached down and placed my hand on the handle. Then I opened it. Everything was still there. The folder of property documents, the investment records Robert had built over decades, the small black notebook, the velvet box with the key, and the letter. I picked up the letter carefully. The paper felt fragile, but the words inside it were anything but. I unfolded it slowly and read the lines I already knew by heart. If she tries to control what isn't hers, if she sees you as a resource instead of a mother, then you must not protect her feelings at the cost of your own dignity. I closed my eyes for a moment. Dignity. That word had stayed with me longer than anything else in that letter. For years I had convinced myself that patience was kindness, that silence was strength, that understanding someone's behavior meant accepting it. But dignity was something different. It wasn't loud, it didn't demand attention, but once you recognized it, you couldn't ignore when it was being taken from you. I folded the letter and placed it back inside the suitcase. Then I closed it and locked it carefully. The click of the lock sounded final, decisive. A soft knock came at the door, and Linda's voice. "Come in." She stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. "You ready?" she asked. "Yes." She looked at the suitcase. "That's the center of it all." "Yes." Linda nodded. "Good." She stepped closer, lowering her voice slightly. "Tonight they're going to push hard. I know, they'll try to keep it private if they can." She continued. "Control the setting, control the narrative." I nodded. "And if I don't let them, then they'll lose control." I met her eyes. "That's exactly what I want." Linda studied me for a moment, then she smiled faintly. "Robert would be proud of you." The words hit me more deeply than I expected. For a second, I had to look away. "Thank you," I said quietly. She stepped back. "I'll be in the room," she added, watching. I nodded. After she left, I took a few minutes to prepare. Not physically, emotionally. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at my reflection. A 67-year-old woman, lines on her face, gray in her hair. Someone Claire had started to see as outdated, replaceable, manageable. I held my own gaze. "No," I whispered softly. "Not anymore." At exactly 7 o'clock, Claire knocked on the door. "Mom, it's time. I'm coming." I picked up the suitcase. It felt heavier than before, not physically but in meaning. Then I opened the door. Claire stood there perfectly dressed, perfectly composed. Ryan just behind her. "Ready?" she asked. "Yes." Her eyes dropped briefly to the suitcase. A flicker of irritation crossed her face. "You're bringing that?" "Yes." Claire forced a smile. "All right." We walked together toward the main house. The sky had darkened into deep shades of blue and gold, and soft lights illuminated the path ahead. Inside, the atmosphere was different from the night before. Smaller, more focused, fewer guests, more attention. Mark stood near the center of the room, speaking with 2 men in suits. When he saw us enter, he smiled. Anne, Claire, Ryan. Claire stepped forward confidently. Mark. Introductions were made, names exchanged, polite smiles all around. But beneath it all, I could feel it. Expectation. Something was about to happen. Dinner began shortly after. The conversation flowed easily at first, wine business travel, but it didn't take long for things to shift. Claire leaned forward slightly. Mark, she said I was telling you about my mom's property in Savannah. There it was. The opening move. Mark nodded. Yes, very interesting location. Ryan joined in. Lots of potential. Claire smiled, and we've been discussing ways to manage it more effectively. I sat quietly, listening, waiting. Claire turned to me. Mom, she said gently, why don't we go ahead and take a look at those documents now? The room didn't go silent, but it changed, subtly. Conversation slowed, attention shifted. Ryan leaned back slightly, watching me carefully. Mark's expression became more focused. Everyone was listening now. I placed my hand on the suitcase. Here, I asked. Claire smiled. Why not? We're all professionals here. Professionals, not family, not love, just business. I nodded slowly. All right. Claire's eyes lit up slightly. She thought she had won. Ryan reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Perfect, he said smoothly. We've prepared everything to make this simple. He placed the documents on the table. Claire leaned closer. All you need to do is sign, she said softly. I looked at the papers, then at her, then at Ryan, and for the first time since this trip began, I smiled. Before I sign anything, I said calmly, I think there are a few things we should all see. Claire's smile faltered slightly. What do you mean? I didn't answer. Instead, I slowly pulled the suitcase onto the table. The worn fabric looked out of place against the polished wood. A few people exchanged curious glances. Claire let out a small, nervous laugh. Mom, what are you doing? I rested my hand on the lock. Then I looked around the room. At Mark, at Ryan, at Claire, and finally, at the people who had been invited to witness what they thought was a simple business conversation. No, I said quietly. Let's do this properly. And then, I turned the key. The sound of the lock turning was soft, but in that room it might as well have been thunder. No one spoke. Not Claire, not Ryan, not Mark. Even the low hum of conversation from the far side of the room seemed to fade as if the air itself was holding its breath. I placed both hands on the suitcase and slowly lifted the lid. For a moment, no one moved. Claire let out a small laugh, the kind people use when they don't understand what's happening but don't want to show it. Mom, she said lightly, this really isn't necessary. I didn't look at her. Instead, I reached inside the suitcase and took out the first folder, the property documents. I placed them carefully on the table beside the papers Ryan had prepared. The contrast was immediate. His documents thin, neatly printed, ready for signatures, mine thicker, worn, filled with years of history. Ryan's expression shifted slightly. What is that? He asked. I looked at him. The full record of the Savannah property, I said calmly. Claire frowned. I already know what that is, Mom. No, I replied gently. You don't. A subtle tension spread across the table. Mark leaned forward slightly. Let her continue, he said. I opened the folder and turned a few pages, letting the documents speak for themselves. Appraisals, I said. Updated valuations. Development interest reports. Claire's eyes narrowed. Mom, we've already talked about. I lifted another page. The current estimated value of the property, I continued, is significantly higher than what you mentioned last night. Ryan leaned in his eyes, scanning the numbers. For the first time, his composure slipped. How recent is this? He asked. Very, I said. Claire looked between us, confusion flickering across her face. What are you talking about? I met her eyes. You told your friends the house was valuable, I said softly. But you didn't know how valuable. The room grew quieter, not completely silent, but close enough that every word carried weight. Ryan straightened slightly. That doesn't change anything, he said smoothly. It just means it's even more important to manage it properly. I nodded, yes. Then I reached into the suitcase again. This time I pulled out the small black notebook. I held it for a moment before placing it on the table. Claire frowned. What is that? My husband's records, I said. Ryan's gaze sharpened. Records of what I opened the notebook. Page after page of neat handwriting filled the lines. Dates, amounts, notes, financial transactions, I said calmly. Specifically, money that left our accounts over the years. Claire shifted in her seat. Mom, I don't understand what you're... I turned the notebook toward her. Take a look. She hesitated, then slowly reached out and flipped through a few pages. At first her expression was blank. Then it changed. Subtly, but unmistakably. What is this? She asked. You tell me, I replied. Ryan leaned closer, his eyes scanning the entries. I watched his face carefully. The confidence, the control, the certainty, all of it began to crack. These are just... Claire started, then stopped. Her voice faltered. Just what I asked, gently. She looked up at me. Those were loans, she said quickly. You said we could borrow that money. Yes, I said, I did. Relief flickered briefly across her face. Then I added, but you never paid it back. The words landed quietly, but they hit harder than anything I had said so far. Claire's mouth opened slightly. That's not, it's written right there, I said, tapping the page lightly. Every amount, every date. Ryan closed the notebook slowly. That's irrelevant, he said. Is it? I asked. His eyes met mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I reached into the suitcase again. The velvet box. I placed it on the table and opened it. The small diamond ring caught the light. A few people leaned in, curious now. And this, I said, is part of the family inheritance. Claire stared at it. I've never seen that before. No, I said, you haven't. Ryan's gaze shifted to the box. What else is in there, he asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I reached in one final time and pulled out the letter. The paper was slightly worn, the edges soft with age, but the words inside it were as sharp as the day they were written. Claire's expression changed immediately. What is that? She asked. My husband's last letter, I said. Ryan sat back slightly. This isn't necessary, Anne, he said carefully. Oh, I think it is, I replied. I unfolded the letter slowly. The room had gone completely still now. Every conversation had stopped. Every eye was on the table, on the suitcase, on me. I looked at Claire, really looked at her. For the first time in years, I saw not just my daughter, but the choices she had made, the distance she had created, the person she had become. Then I began to read. If you're hearing this, I said softly, it means I was right to worry. Claire's face went pale. Mom, she whispered, I didn't stop. I hoped I was wrong, I continued. I hoped our daughter would never see you as anything other than her mother. Ryan shifted in his seat. And this is inappropriate. I raised my hand slightly, and he stopped. But if she does, I read my voice steady, if she begins to treat you as something to manage instead of someone to love. Claire shook her head. Stop, she said. I didn't. Then you must protect yourself. The words filled the room. Heavy, unavoidable, final. Claire pushed her chair back slightly. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice shaking. You're twisting things. I lowered the letter slowly. No, I said. I'm finally seeing them clearly. Ryan leaned forward, his voice sharper now. This doesn't change anything, he said. We're trying to help you. I looked at him. No, I replied calmly. You're trying to control me. The silence that followed was absolute. Claire's eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not anger, not confidence, something closer to fear, and for the first time since this began, she realized she had no idea what was really inside that suitcase. The silence didn't break all at once. It fractured, first with a soft scrape of a chair somewhere behind us, then the faint clink of a glass being set down too carefully, then a low murmur that quickly died as people realized something serious was unfolding in front of them. Every eye in the room was on us now, on the open suitcase, on the documents spread across the table, on Claire, on me. Claire stood halfway up from her chair, her hands hovering uncertainly at her sides. This is insane, she said, but her voice had lost its earlier strength. Mom, you're making a scene. I looked at her calmly. No, I said quietly. I'm telling the truth. Ryan leaned forward, his tone tightening. This is private family business, he said, glancing briefly at Mark and the others. There's no reason to involve everyone here. I turned my head slowly and met his gaze. Then you shouldn't have brought business into family. The words landed harder than I expected. Ryan's jaw tightened. Claire shook her head, trying to regain control. Mom, you're confused, she said quickly. You don't understand how these things work. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger, not hurt, clarity. I understand perfectly, I replied. She laughed nervously. No, you don't. You're taking things out of context. Then explain them, I said. The room waited. Claire hesitated. For a moment, she looked exactly like the child she used to be when she didn't have an answer in class. But this time, there was no teacher to rescue her. Ryan stepped in. "The documents we prepared are standard," he said smoothly. "They're designed to help manage assets efficiently." I interrupted him gently. "With a clause that allows you to assume control if I'm deemed incapable," the words cut through his explanation like a blade. Ryan froze. Just for a second, but it was enough. Mark leaned forward slightly. "Is that true?" he asked. Ryan recovered quickly. "It's a safeguard," he said, "for her benefit." "For my benefit," I repeated. Claire stepped forward again, her voice rising. "Yes, for your benefit," she said. "You're alone, Mom. You can't manage everything forever." There it was. Not hidden, not softened, the truth. "I've managed just fine," I said quietly. "Until now," Claire snapped. The sharpness in her tone startled even her. She blinked, then quickly tried to soften it. "I mean, things get more complicated as you get older." I watched her carefully. "Or as they become more valuable?" I asked. Claire's lips pressed together. Ryan spoke again, more controlled this time. "And this is exactly why we wanted to handle this privately," he said. "Misunderstandings like this can get emotional." I nodded. "Yes." Then I reached into the suitcase once more. "There's one more thing," I said. I took out a final set of documents, thicker, more official. I placed them on top of everything else. Ryan's eyes dropped to the pages, and for the first time, he didn't speak. Claire looked at him. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. I did. "A trust," I said. Claire frowned. "What a legal trust," I continued. "Established before Robert passed away." Ryan's face had gone completely still. "Anne," he said slowly, but I kept going. "All major assets, property, investments accounts have already been transferred." Claire shook her head. "That's not possible." "It is," I said. Ryan finally spoke again, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "When was this done? Months before he died?" Claire stared at me. "You're lying." I shook my head. "No." She turned to Ryan. "Tell her." But Ryan didn't look at her. He was still staring at the documents, reading, processing, calculating, and realizing. "This changes things," he said quietly. Claire's voice rose. "What do you mean it changes things?" Ryan looked up at me. "You didn't mention this," he said. "You didn't ask the right questions," I replied. The room shifted again. The power in the conversation had moved. Completely. Claire looked between us, her composure unraveling. "So what does that mean?" she demanded. "It means," I said calmly, "that you cannot access or control anything without my direct consent." Ryan exhaled slowly. "And even then," he asked. "There are conditions," I said. His eyes closed briefly, then opened again, understanding, defeat. Claire stepped back, shaking her head. "No," she said. "No, that's not how this works. It is now." I replied, her voice broke. "You were supposed to trust me." The words hung in the air. I felt something in my chest tighten, but I didn't let it change my voice. "I did," I said softly, "for a long time." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "But you didn't tell me about this," she said. "You didn't need to know," I replied. Ryan stood slowly. "We should talk about this privately," he said. I shook my head. "No." Claire looked at me, her expression shifting again, this time to anger. "You're humiliating us," she said. I met her gaze. "You did that to me at the airport." The words were quiet, but they landed harder than anything else I had said. Claire flinched, just slightly, but enough. Around us, the room had become completely still. No one was pretending not to watch anymore. Mark cleared his throat. "I think we should all take a moment," he said carefully, but no one moved. No one left. Because something irreversible had already begun. Claire looked at me again. Her voice was quieter now, almost desperate. "Mom, we were just trying to help." I studied her face. The cracks were no longer subtle. They were visible, raw, and for the first time I saw something real. Not confidence, not control, fear. But it wasn't fear of losing me. It was fear of losing what she thought she would gain. I picked up the letter again. "Help doesn't look like this," I said gently. Claire's shoulders dropped slightly. Ryan said nothing. The documents remained spread across the table, the truth finally visible. And in that moment, everyone in that room understood something Claire had not. The cheap suitcase she had laughed at in the airport was the one thing she had never truly seen. No one rushed to fill the silence, not this time. It settled over the room like something heavy and permanent, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain. The kind of silence that follows truth, not confusion. Claire stood still, her hands trembling just slightly at her sides. Ryan remained upright beside her, but something in his posture had changed. The easy confidence he carried all weekend had disappeared, replaced by something more rigid, calculated, defensive. Mark exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. Well, he said quietly, "That clarifies quite a bit." Claire turned toward him quickly. "Mark, this isn't what it looks like," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Then what does it look like?" Claire opened her mouth, closed it again. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't have an immediate answer. Ryan stepped in. "This is being misunderstood," he said. "We were simply trying to help Anne organize her assets more efficiently." I watched him carefully. He was choosing his words with precision now, less charm, more strategy. I nodded slightly. "Then explain the clause," I said. Ryan hesitated. "Which one?" "The one that allows you to assume control if I'm deemed incapable," I replied calmly. A few people shifted in their seats. Mark's expression hardened slightly. "That's a serious provision," he said. Ryan forced a small smile. "It's standard in some cases." Not without clear justification. Linda's voice came from across the room. All eyes turned. She stepped forward, composed, steady, undeniable. Especially not when the individual in question shows no sign of incapacity. Ryan's jaw tightened. "Linda," he said. "Ryan," she replied calmly. Claire looked between them, confusion and frustration building. "Why is everyone acting like this is some kind of crime?" she snapped. No one answered immediately. Because no one needed to. Claire's voice rose slightly. "We were trying to protect her." I looked at her. "From what?" she faltered. From making mistakes. Like trusting her daughter, I asked. The words hit her harder than I expected. She took a step back. "That's not fair." "No," I said softly. "It isn't." The room shifted again. The tension no longer felt like anticipation. It felt like consequence. Ryan straightened slightly, regaining some of his composure. "Let's be realistic," he said. "Assets at this level require management." "Then manage your own," I replied. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Mark crossed his arms. "I think the issue here," he said slowly, "is transparency." Ryan didn't respond. Claire looked at him. "Say something," she whispered, but Ryan was already stepping back, subtly, carefully, creating distance. And that, more than anything else, changed the atmosphere. Claire saw it too, her head turned sharply toward him. "Ryan." He avoided her eyes. "We should take a step back," he said. Her voice broke. A step back from what Ryan exhaled slowly. "This isn't the right environment for this discussion." Claire stared at him. "You brought us here," she said. "You said this would work." A few people exchanged glances. The truth was unraveling now. Not in a dramatic explosion, but in small, undeniable pieces. I reached for the black notebook again and placed it closer to Claire. "Do you remember these?" I asked gently. She didn't touch it this time. "I told you," she said quickly. "Those were loans." "Yes," I said. "And what happens when loans are never repaid?" She shook her head. "That's not how family works." I nodded. "You're right." Then I leaned forward slightly. "That's not how family works." The difference in meaning hung between us. Claire's breathing became uneven. "You're turning everything against me," she said. "No," I replied. "I'm showing everything as it is." Ryan finally spoke again, but his voice was quieter now. "Claire, we should go." She turned to him, stunned. "What? This isn't helping," he said. Claire stared at him. "You're leaving." "I'm stepping out of this," he corrected. The distinction was clear, painfully clear. Claire's voice dropped. "You said we were in this together." Ryan hesitated. For a second, just a second, he looked like he might say something honest, but then he didn't. "I think it's best if we handle things separately from here," he said. And with that, he stepped back. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. The room seemed to shift around Claire as if something invisible had been removed from beneath her. Her foundation, her certainty, her plan. She looked around, searching for support, but all she found were eyes. Watching, evaluating, understanding. Finally, seeing, she turned back to me, and for the first time there was no performance left, no polish, no control, just raw emotion. "You think I'm a bad person," she said. I looked at her, really looked, at the woman she had become and the girl she used to be. "I think you made bad choices," I said. Omir's filled her eyes. "I was trying to build something," she said. "At what cost?" I asked. She didn't answer. because she couldn't. Not honestly. The room remained still. The documents lay open, the truth fully exposed, and in that moment, there was nothing left to hide behind. Claire's voice softened, almost a whisper. I didn't think it would go this far, I nodded. That's usually how it starts. She looked down at the table, at the suitcase, at the things she had never bothered to understand. Then she said something I hadn't expected. I was afraid she admitted. The room shifted again, not with tension, but with something quieter, more human, of what I asked. Her voice trembled, of losing everything. I felt something in my chest tighten, not because of what she said, but because of what she meant. Everything. Not me, not family, everything else. I leaned back slightly. You already did, I said. The words were not cruel, but they were final, and Claire knew it. No one applauded. There was no dramatic exit, no raised voices echoing through the vineyard house, no sudden explosion to match the tension that had built all evening. Instead, everything unraveled quietly, slowly, in a way that felt more real than anything loud ever could. Claire stood in the center of the room, completely still, as if moving might make everything collapse faster. Ryan had already stepped back far enough to become a spectator, not a partner, not an ally, just another person watching the consequences unfold. Mark was the first to speak. I think it's best we call it a night, he said, his tone measured but firm. No one argued. One by one, people began to stand, gathering their things, offering polite but distant goodbyes. No one looked at Claire the same way they had before, and she knew it. That was the hardest part to watch. Not the anger, not the confrontation, but the shift. The quiet, irreversible shift in how people saw her. The image she had spent years building carefully, deliberately, had cracked in a matter of minutes, and there was no way to fix it. Claire's breathing was uneven now. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't move, didn't interrupt. I let her find her own words. For once. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said. I studied her face. There was something different there now. Not control, not calculation, something closer to exposure. "You didn't mean to get caught," I said quietly. The words landed gently, but they didn't soften the truth. Claire flinched. "That's not fair," she said, her voice breaking. "Isn't it?" I asked. She shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "I was trying to fix things," she said. "What things are life?" she replied. The word "our" echoed strangely between us. I tilted my head slightly. "Your life," I corrected. She wiped at her face, frustrated. "You don't understand," she said. "Things aren't as stable as they look." I waited. And for the first time, she didn't hide it. "Ryan's investments. They haven't been doing well," she admitted. "We've been trying to stay ahead," but she stopped. But it didn't matter. The rest was obvious. Debt, pressure, fear, and a solution that had seemed easy, too easy. "So you decided to use me," I said. Her eyes widened. "No, yes," I said, still calm. "You didn't come here to spend time with me." She shook her head again, but slower this time. Less convincing. "We thought—" She began, then faltered. "What did you think I asked?" "That you wouldn't mind," she said finally. The honesty of it hit harder than anything else. Not because it was cruel, but because it was casual, like it had made sense to her. Like it had been reasonable. I let out a slow breath. "You didn't ask," I said. She looked down. I didn't think I had to. There it was. The truth beneath everything else. Not desperation, not fear, entitlement. Ryan shifted slightly behind her. "Clary," said quietly. "We should go." She didn't turn. "I'm not done," she said. He hesitated, then stepped back again. Further this time. Completely removed. And just like that, Claire stood alone. She looked at me again. This time there was no anger left. Only something raw. "I messed up," she said. I didn't answer right away, because the words themselves weren't enough. They never are. Finally, I said yes. The simplicity of it seemed to hit her harder than anything else. Her shoulders dropped. Her posture collapsed slightly. "What happens now?" she asked. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't defensive. It was a real question. And that made it harder. I looked at the table, at the documents, at the suitcase, then back at her. "What happens now," I said slowly, "is that things change." She nodded faintly. I figured. I took a step forward. Just one, enough to close some of the distance, but not all of it. I'm not signing anything, I continued. I know, you're not managing my assets. She swallowed. I understand. And you don't get to treat me like I'm something to be handled. Her eyes filled again. I'm sorry. The words came out softer this time, less practiced, more real. I studied her for a long moment. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say. Sorry doesn't fix this. She nodded. I know. Another silence. Not tense, not sharp, just heavy. What do I do? She asked. I considered the question. There were a lot of answers. None of them easy, none of them immediate. You start by telling the truth, I said. She blinked. To who? To yourself, I replied. That seemed to stop her, completely. Because that was the part she couldn't perform, couldn't control, couldn't shape into something acceptable. Ryan cleared his throat again. Claire. This time she turned. Slowly, she looked at him. Really looked. And something in her expression changed. You knew, she said. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Her voice hardened slightly. You knew exactly what we were doing. Ryan sighed. It made sense. That was all he said. And somehow it said everything. Claire stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. Not in agreement, in understanding, the kind that comes too late. She turned back to me. I'll leave tomorrow, she said quietly. I nodded. That's probably best. She hesitated, then asked, Can I come see you? Later, I didn't answer immediately, because this part mattered, more than everything else. Finally, I said, maybe. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no, and for now, that was all she deserved. Claire nodded slowly. I understand. She stepped back, not dramatically, not in anger, just back, creating space, accepting it. For the first time in years, I watched her walk away, not as the confident woman who had laughed at my suitcase in the airport, but as someone who had just realized how much she had lost. Not money, not opportunity, something deeper, something harder to rebuild, something that doesn't come back easily once it's broken. Behind me, the suitcase still sat open on the table, old, worn, unimpressive, but it had done what nothing else could. It had revealed the truth. And tonight, that had been enough. The vineyard was quiet the next morning, not the curated quiet of soft music and distant laughter from the night before. This was something different. Honest quiet, the kind that settles after something has ended. I woke up earlier than usual. For a moment I didn't move. I just lay there watching the pale morning light stretch across the ceiling, listening to the stillness around me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt light. Not happy, not relieved, but lighter, like something I'd been carrying for years had finally been set down. I sat up slowly and looked across the room. The suitcase was still there, closed now, resting exactly where I had left it the night before. From the outside, nothing about it had changed. Still worn, still outdated, still something Claire would have been embarrassed to be seen with. But I saw it differently now, not because of what it contained, but because of what it had revealed. I got out of bed, walked over, and placed my hand gently on the handle. For a moment I considered opening it again, looking through everything, reliving the night. But I didn't. I didn't need to. Some truths don't need to be revisited once they've been seen clearly. A soft knock came at the door. I already knew who it was. Come in, I said. The door opened slowly. Claire stepped inside. She looked different. Not dramatically, but enough. Her hair was pulled back simply. No makeup, no carefully chosen outfit. Just her, or at least closer to who she used to be. Hi, she said quietly. Hi. She stood near the door for a moment, unsure, then took a few steps inside. I didn't want to leave without talking to you, she said. I nodded. That's fair. She glanced at the suitcase, then back at me. I didn't sleep, she admitted. I figured. A small, sad smile touched her face. Yeah. She hesitated, then asked, Can I sit, of course? She sat on the edge of the chair near the window. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, I've been thinking about everything. I waited. She looked down at her hands. I kept telling myself I was doing the right thing, she continued, that I was being practical, responsible. Her voice trembled slightly, but I wasn't. I didn't interrupt, because this part mattered. I was scared, she said, of losing everything we built. I met her eyes. And what did you build it on? I asked gently. She swallowed. That's the problem, she said. There was a long pause, then she took a deep breath. I treated you like an asset, she admitted. The word hung in the air between us. Honest, ugly, real. Yes, I said. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. I don't know when I became that person, she said. I studied her quietly. You didn't become her overnight, I said. No, she whispered. That's what scares me. Another silence, but this one felt different, less heavy, more open. What happens now? She asked. I walked slowly to the window, looking out over the vineyard. The rows of vines stretched into the distance, unchanged by anything that had happened inside the house. Nature doesn't care about human mistakes. It just keeps growing. You go back to your life, I said. She nodded slowly. And you? She asked. I go back to mine. She hesitated. And us? I turned to face her. That was the hardest question. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I had too many. Pain, love, disappointment, memory, all tangled together. We don't go back, I said finally. Her face fell slightly. I figured. But I continued, that doesn't mean we can't go forward. She looked at me, hope flickering carefully in her eyes. Forward, how slowly, I said, honestly, and with boundaries. She nodded. I understand. Do you? I asked gently. Yes. I held her gaze. For example, I said, you don't get access to my finances. I know. You don't make decisions for me. I know. And you don't treat me like something that needs to be managed. Her voice broke slightly. I won't. I watched her carefully, not to judge, but to see, to really see. And for the first time in a long time, I believed she meant it. Not because she said it perfectly, but because she said it imperfectly, honestly. She stood slowly. I'm going to leave today, she said. I think that's a good idea. She nodded, then hesitated again. I'd like to visit you, she said, in Savannah. Not yet, I replied gently. She nodded. I understand. Another pause. Then she asked, can I call you yes? That seemed to mean more to her than anything else. Okay, she said softly. She took a step toward me, then stopped. Can I? She began, then trailed off. I understood what she was asking. I took one step forward. Not all the way, just enough. She closed the distance, and for the first time in a very long time, my daughter hugged me, not tightly, not desperately, but carefully, like she understood something fragile had to be handled differently now. I didn't hold her for long, but I didn't pull away either. When we stepped back, her eyes were red, but clearer. Thank you, she said. For what, for not? Shutting me out completely. I nodded. That depends on what you do next. She gave a small, shaky smile. Fair. Then she turned and walked toward the door. This time, I didn't stop her. I let her go, because some distances have to be walked alone. After she left, I stood in the quiet room for a while. Then I walked over to the suitcase one last time. I opened it slowly. Everything was still there. The documents, the notebook, the letter, the past, the truth. I closed it again, gently. Then I moved it off the bed and placed it near the door. Not hidden, not protected, just there. Because it had already done its job. It had carried everything that needed to be revealed. And in the end, it wasn't just a suitcase. It was a line, a boundary, a moment where everything changed. Later that day, I left Napa Valley on my own. No luxury car, no audience. Just me and my old worn suitcase. And for the first time in years, I wasn't embarrassed by it. Not even a little. Because I finally understood something Claire didn't. The value of something isn't in how it looks. It's in what it holds. And sometimes, the things that look the cheapest are the ones that cost the most to lose. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones we once trusted without question. This story isn't just about money or property or a suitcase. It's about boundaries. It's about dignity. And it's about the moment you realize that love without respect isn't really love at all. Anne didn't win because she exposed the truth. She won because she chose not to lose herself while facing it. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean giving someone the same access to hurt you again. It means choosing what you will allow moving forward. Claire's journey didn't end that night. It started there, because real change doesn't come from being exposed. It comes from what you do after. So let me ask you, what would you have done in Anne's place? Would you forgive? Would you walk away, or would you do exactly what she did? And choose boundaries first. If this story made you feel something, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more real emotional storytelling. And I'd really love to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Your stories matter too.